One of the most lucid commentators about all this is Dan Wild, the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs in Melbourne. And he joins me now. Dan, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Dan, first, one of Labor's signature policies at the moment is to flood the nation with immigrants. There's going to be 400,000 of them this financial year alone. Why do you think Labor is doing this, and what effect will it have on the people who already live here?
Well, that's right. There's a fairly significant expansion to the migration program, which is planned over the next 2 years. And look, a lot of Australians in the community are concerned about what this is going to mean in terms of our capacity to manage it from an infrastructure perspective, from schools, roads, hospitals and housing. You know, as we know, we've got a housing shortage at the moment. Rental prices are going up very rapidly. So, in the absence of more infrastructure, this is going to exacerbate those challenges and put upward pressure on prices and inflation. So, look, a lot of Australians are saying that, yes, we're a very welcoming and tolerant nation, and migrants have and will continue to play a critical role in our social and economic life. But what we really need is our governments to be focused on getting the infrastructure settings right and focused on getting Australians into jobs first, getting those policy settings right, before we look abroad to bring in greater population numbers.
This is going to hurt people at the bottom the most. Labor's meant to be the party of the working people. I still can't understand why they're doing it, Dan.
Well, it's a good question as to why they're doing it. It seems the migration review was rushed and ill-considered in terms of not taking a holistic view of the challenges. You're quite right. The extra competition that will take place in Australia for local jobs could have a negative effect at those at the bottom of the income ladder. We know, from economics, if you increase the supply of something, the price will go down, and the labour market is no different in that regard. So, yeah, you're right. It shows that the Labor Party, for many years has been moving away from being a party representing the interests of workers. For many, many years, Labor was often the party that was more so likely to be in favour of a smaller, more targeted migration program. But over recent years, they've very much become the party of big Australia and fairly rapid population growth. Again, I think that migration can play an important role, but my concern here is that the government just isn't planning for this in the proper way.
Well, the most emblematic microcosm of this is housing, I think. The housing problem is, of course, created in the first place by the government. I mean, Australia is a nation of tradies, and we have, as our national anthem says, boundless plains to share. But we aren't building houses because governments keep getting in the way. Now, having created the problem, the government is offering itself as the solution by encouraging a boom in two new categories of housing called build-to-rent and affordable housing. Now, these are a radical departure from the Australian dream, aren't they, Dan?
There they are. It's a pretty critical point, Fred. The first point is in terms of all the costs government piles on. Something like 1/3 of the cost of building a house is red tape and tax and various other charges. So immediately that's another, 100,000 to 300,000 on your house, on your mortgage before you even get going. But you're right, more broadly, it's a cultural problem. Australia, in the post-World War II era was built on home ownership. That was the basis of a prosperous middle class. It's the basis of our egalitarianism that, everybody, provided that you've got a job, you'll be able to own a home. And that's been the basis of the Australian way of life. It's made our nation relatively unique. And it's also been, a source of upward mobility. If you own your own home, you have a stake in your community, you have a stake in your nation's future. It's the absolute glue and the fabric of a democratic nation like Australia's. So this build to rent move, where basically these big investment banks buy up massive apartment blocks and rent them out where people aren't able to buy those themselves, is a huge concern, and it's really is I think an existential threat to our egalitarian way of life.
Yeah, and as Labor colluding with the big end of town and pretending that they're solving the problem when they're not.